I have stumbled around and tried to figure out exactly what I wanted to talk about for this video, and I've noticed within a lot of retrospectives or just a general analysis video that talk about Devil May Cry 5 or just Devil May Cry in general, people tend to talk about the story elements within the game and kind of gloss over certain aspects within the gameplay. For this particular video that I've wanted to do, I will be talking about a lot of gameplay elements and gameplay mechanics that in general enhance the gameplay of Devil May Cry 5. But that's not to say that the story elements are bad. Like, trust me, I don't mind them. In fact, I like the story, especially in DMC3. But I really want to talk about the core of the game, which is the gameplay. There is quite a lot to cover over, as you can tell by the length of this video. So sit back, grab some popcorn, and enjoy me ramble about my experience on Devil May Cry 5's gameplay. Going into DMC5's campaign again was honestly a treat. I went through the game normally with Nero, V, and Dante, and to be 100% transparent, I have used texture mods to change the look of the game, mostly with the character models, and I have also used gameplay mods that have made the game feel similar to turbo mode, since somehow, in the Steam version at least, it is not available to use at all. There is no option for it, so of course, with the PC version, you have to use mods. Another thing that I've used mods for were animation fixes that removes extra frames of animations within certain moves like million stabs or the ending frames of Royal Guard. This allows me to basically play without feeling like I'm kind of stuck in molasses. Outside of this, everything else is pretty vanilla. I tried to keep my game as vanilla as possible with a few things that kind of bothered me, which I will go into later. As I booted up the game and I started the first mission, one of the very first things that I noticed going back into this game was that it dumps a lot of information onto you. I believe that this was the game's way of trying to add more features that were accessible to newcomers. Tutorials upon tutorials, the game reminds you about different abilities and skills to take advantage of, which I liked seeing. Every time that a new feature or a new weapon pops up, DMC5 will just remind you that, hey, you got this cool weapon here, go check it out. This is kind of a great way to remind beginners about their toolset for each character. However, I wish DMC5 did more with teaching the players about certain moves' utility in combos. DMC Devil May Cry had demos within loading screens that showed off combos utilizing various moves and gave concepts for the player to try out. DMC5, on the other hand, only told you about these moves, but never really showed them off the same way that DMC Devil May Cry did. It did show you a preview of each move and let you try them out before purchasing them, but it would have been more helpful if the game displayed at least different types of combos for you to follow along. Speaking of showing off your moves, you now have access to a fully fledged training room called The Void that had even more options in the reboot. This was a terrific decision that DMC5 has done by a landslide. I cannot stress how important it is for action games with engaging gameplay to feature a training room. You can change the status of the enemy to attack or remain docile, change the enemy to a different one, and you can toggle infinite health just in case you don't want the demon to die. I wish you can add multiple enemies or bosses so you don't have to go back through missions just to face a particular boss, but Void definitely works as a functioning practice area. One specific nitpick that I have for Void though, is that whatever difficulty that you had selected before entering this room, the enemy now is set to that difficulty. This includes Dante Must Die mode, where enemies will often go through their powered up state, which is double trigger, so they gain super armor that you have to bypass with enough attacks done. Having to deal with this every time you wish to launch an enemy is downright annoying. You have the option to reset the room, but it's much better to just select a different difficulty option to avoid doing all of this. this. I think the best solution in this case would just give us an option to change the difficulty within the training room. That way we don't have to go back to the campaign and just select a different difficulty and then go back to Void. For the actual levels of the campaign, I personally believe that this was the most enjoyable experience I've had with any campaign for Devil May Cry. For Devil May Cry 3 and 4, I thought they were okay, but some areas I got really frustrated on, mostly because of enemy types that I didn't like, and certain parts of the environment was not really fun to walk around in, but I will talk about that in a later portion of this video. I went through the game with the new save file on Devil Hunter mode, and I kept a backup just in case something went wrong. With the approach of having missions focused more on fighting rather than platforming, I honestly really welcome this change. I am a huge fan of Devil May Cry's combat, so that reason alone is why I was not bothered by this. The majority of the areas that you fight demons in are within a wide open space that is comparable to fighting in Bloody Palace. If it's possible in the future though, I would definitely love to see platforming sections where you can use your moves to traverse specific areas, similar to how Guacamelee and the Ori series handled their platforming. As for the environment itself, going through the campaign was not that bad. The gothic styled buildings that we were used to before in the previous series were now replaced by a more modern setting, with buildings entangled by giant masses of demonic roots. Then later in the campaign, you see more of the tree's interior as you climb your way up. The change in scenery was great, along with the updated graphics and visuals, but over time the landscape tends to overstay its welcome a bit. In fact, during the latter half of the campaign, it presents you with similar scenery compared to even the prologue. Now for me, I'm not very picky when it comes to environments within action games, but I definitely would like to have more variety here. After the campaign is completed, Bloody Palace becomes unlocked for you to play, and honestly, I believe that DMC5's version of BP beats the other versions. There are the usual 101 floors that you go through with each character, but you can also revisit floors that you have already completed. If you find yourself getting tired midway through this mode, you can resume your progress for later, although it's under very strict conditions where you cannot go to any game mode after leaving BP. In fact, this holds true for all the game modes in Devil May Cry 5. Even if you're in the middle of a mission, going to Void resets this progress. I thought this decision did not make much sense to me, even for Bloody Palace, but at least you still have the option to have Bloody Palace, I guess. For the enemy designs, when I analyze them compared to what I've played in the previous DMC titles, I have to say that I'm a little content on what we have. The majority of the enemies have their own gimmicks that you have to figure out and overcome, as usual, and most of these gimmicks aren't too bad to deal with. They can be kind of enjoyable to mess around with, but it's a mixed bag. For example, Hell Antinoras have this property where if you smack them away with certain attacks, they will immediately counterattack with super armor. This gives you the opportunity to clash against them with a parry. While they're in the air, you have to make sure not to use moves that have knockback properties, otherwise they will just launch away from you and they'll fall to the ground while being immune to any sort of stun. They are still pretty fun to fight though. I also thought that the Judicas was pretty dope as well. They can summon other Hellspawn, have different attack patterns that are long range and close range, and they can put pressure on you when they pop in and out of the arena with portals. Even knowing that they can escape out of combos easily, their interaction with you feels engaging. Like they actually feel like I'm fighting something that's fighting back. While I did like these two particular enemies the most, outside of the other enemies like Hellkainas, Impusas, Dariads, and etc., I can definitely say that there are other demons that have really disappointed me. The Secudo Angelos felt like very inferior versions of the Bianco Angelos in Devil May Cry 4. Bianco Angelos felt more threatening than the Secudo Angelos because their shield not only served as a wall for you to break through, but also functioning wings. If left unchecked, Bianco Angelos can use them to escape combos and fly in the air. They also have an attack that is designed to knock you out the air if you're near them. The Angelos in Devil May Cry 5 possess shields that were more durable, however, there are weapons that bypass their shield easily, like Cavalier or Helter Skelter. As for the Proto-Angelos by themselves, oh man. You remember Ultra Angelos in DMC4? You remember them? Do you remember how they had different types of formations that they would do with Bianco Angelos? Such as commanding them to advance with their shields, track you with a pincer attack, tell them to dive bomb you, have the ability to regenerate their shields, or summon a giant energy ball that you can reflect back at them. Remember that? Yeah, we got none of that here. All we have is this rusted, crusted up demon knight that just leisurely walks up to you with the most telegraph attack in the history of Devil May Cry. My boy ain't looking so good. And don't get me started on the interactions that he has with his fellow soldiers. He is letting them down, because all he can do is sit there charging with his sword while you have all the time in the world to just walk up to him and knock him out of his concentration. It's like he's being hyped up by his homies and they're like, yeah, you go get that, Dante. And since this one squad shares the same brain cell, all of them lose focus. Like, their morale is just completely shattered because, like, they put a lot of faith on this one Proto-Angelo. And when you think I'm done, there's even more things to talk about, such as his health. His health makes absolutely no sense. Why does he live for so long? I have spent less time fighting a behemoth or a Queen Impusa compared to fighting a freaking Proto-Angelo. And this is the reason why they have so much health. When you fight Proto-Angelos on Dante Must Die mode, and when you get their health to a certain threshold, their defense increases to where they take half damage. And then Double Trigger kicks in for them, because it's Dante Must Die mode, and then they take half of that damage. Yeah, that's the reason why they take so long to kill. Outside of listing most of the negatives and positives that I have for specific enemy designs, I think one prominent issue that I have is that across most of the enemies, or at least some of them, is that due to the color palette of the environment and the enemies and the nature of their attack patterns, it seems to be hard to spot out when a specific enemy is attacking you. Not when you're fighting one individual enemy, but specifically when you're fighting a group of them. I'm not sure if this is a personal problem, but I have an easier time knowing when I'm going to be attacked by a certain enemy in DMC3, 4, or even other action games like Bayonetta, which have amazing attack cues. With this game, it's kind of harder to tell which enemy is attacking me, especially since their sound cues aren't really consistent. Take a listen here.
Fight.
Merciful bat.
Not fight.
Merciful bat.
Not fight.
Merciful bat.
Not fight.
Now for the big baddies of the game, which are the bosses. The bosses in Devil May Cry 5 are some of the best bosses within the franchise, no doubt. There are definitely some fun fights within the mix like Cavalier, Vergil, King Cerberus, and the final form of Urizen. In addition to this, the boss count is the highest I've seen in a Devil May Cry game, even more than DMC3. Cavalier, who's my personal favorite boss, felt like a boss designed to test a player's knowledge on parrying and royal guarding. Many of his sword strikes are telegraphed in a clear way for you to react to, but not too slow because they can catch you off guard. Disrupting his attacks consecutively rewards the player by stunning him, which allows you to wail on him even further. He feels very reactive, constantly shifting his attacks depending on how far you are away from him, and he follows you with projectile attacks if you're too far away. When it comes to the rest of the boss fights, I felt like everything else was okay. The Urizen throne fights felt like they dragged a bit too long, and I wasn't really much of a fan of Artemis. Goliath was okay. There's a lot of high spectacle moments where he's destroying the environment around him, and that's pretty cool, but he felt like a giant walking sponge. As for Artemis, you're constantly chasing after her, just all the time. And I think the weakest boss is, unfortunately, V's boss fight, which is Nidhogg. Between him and Gilgamesh, I think both of those were pretty bad. I mean, it's better than fighting freaking Wall Agnes in Devil May Cry 4, but at the same time, I didn't want to fight a literal walking platform. I guess, overall, the bosses felt pleasant to fight, but aggressive enough so they keep you engaged in the game. They challenge you, but at the same time, they gave you enough leeway so you can avoid their attack patterns, Overall, they're just generally good. Like, they're pretty good. Now it's time to dive into the most important aspect of Devil May Cry, which are the characters that you play as. There are 4 of them to choose from, and each of them have their own depth. And the first one that I would like to go over is Nero. When Devil May Cry 5 came out and Nero was shown off in the previews, initially I was a little worried that he wouldn't have much. Despite playing this character for a religiously long amount of time, I did not like the small set of attacks that he had to work with. While it is true that Nero gets a lot of mileage out of his toolkit in Devil May Cry 4, I can't help but to feel that he should at least have more to deal with when you compare him to Vergil or Dante. But my worries ended up melting away when it was shown that not only that Nero had new moves to work with the weapons that he had, but he had a completely new set of tools called Devil Breakers. With his toolkit being expanded upon, they also underwent a few changes. With Red Queen, revving the sword to gain Exceed in Devil May Cry 4 usually slows you down into a walking speed. This also halted your momentum when you were in the air too. But in Devil May Cry 5, they changed this so you can run while you're doing it. So after you're done fighting a room full of demons, you can fill up your Exceed gauge while running to the next destination. I will say that I kind of missed how it worked in Devil May Cry 4 because you can cancel certain attack strings and you can halt your aerial momentum for positioning. With the Exceed gauge making its return, there was also a mechanic of pressing the rev button as you swing your sword, which allows you to gain 1 bar of Exceed. This was called X Act. Doing this perfectly is called a Max Act, and it rewards you by having all of your lamps filled up. In the previous game, if you missed your input, then that's it. You don't gain any meter at all. However, in Devil May Cry 5, if you missed the timing for X Act, you will still be rewarded for a small gain of Exceed. This actually was a good thing because it encouraged people to use this mechanic even though they failed the right timing for it. And in due time, they start getting a better feel of the timing so they can actually perform X Acts and even Max Acts better. When the gauge has at least 1 lamp, the next attack that you perform becomes much faster and more powerful than the standard attack. This is true for both DMC4 and 5. However, there is one move that received a few changes, and that's Nero's Caliber attack. In DMC4, this move had multi-hit properties that allowed you to jump cancel before the knockback actually happens. In DMC5, Caliber does not have this property at all. Instead, the move becomes faster and it travels farther. I don't mind this change that much, but that's due to a very unique ability that Nero has, which I'll explain soon. But I want to talk about the new moves that Red Queen acquired, which were Paylon and Hardway. Paylon acts like a diving attack that launches towards the enemy, and Hardway closes the gap between you and the enemy with a leaping attack. You can even redirect this move without locking on, which makes it pretty versatile. It even gives you a small opportunity to jump cancel before Nero slams his sword on the ground. I honestly like both of these moves, especially with Paylon because it adds more options to Nero's movement. But I do wish the tracking was a bit better, kind of like how Dante's friction attack performs. But overall, it functions well. With Red Queen, Nero also comes with Blue Rose, and this gun received quite a bit of changes. The rate of fire that this gun has is slower when you compare it to its previous counterpart, although it packs more power and you can shoot it while rolling. Blue Rose was also given an additional mechanic called Color Up, which allows the player to load up special bullets by holding down the gun button. Any shots that are fired with these bullets will cause a demon to be stunned, and if this is done while they're in the air, it keeps them in the air longer, and you can cancel knockback properties for many different moves. If you continue to hold down the gun button after using Color Up, you will begin to further charge Blue Rose. Each charge has a level between 1, 2, and 3, which is combined with Color Up. Overall, this charge mechanic works similarly to how it did in Devil May Cry 4, but due to Color Up, there is a slight delay for the initial explosion. But the best thing about Charge Shot in this game is that you can actually use Charge Shot while you're rolling. While I do like the effect that Color Up has, such as stunning enemies, keeping them in the air longer, negating knockback from certain attacks, I can't help but to feel that it's a little redundant. Like, you have to load up your special bullets and then you have to charge Blue Rose. but 9 times out of 10, you are charging blue rolls all the time and not focusing on using color up. And then if you are using color up, you're only using it for 3 bullets and then you have to keep charging it over and over again. And then there's also the fact that why would you use regular bullets at all when you have color up? So again, I don't understand why we just could not have color up as a regular bullet, but it's whatever, I guess. Yet, here's where more stuff comes into play. While Nero has both Red Queen and Blue Rose with expanded movesets and different mechanics for at least Blue Rose, they still felt somewhat limiting on their own. This is where Devil Breakers come into play. They serve as weapon consumables that gives Nero more utility compared to his base kit. Each arm has different abilities ranging between slowing down enemies with time to riding a rocket arm. You can equip the arms that you want to use within the equipment menu. These Devil Breakers are scattered across in the missions that you played in order for you to pick them up, and if a demon managed to just mosey over the arm, they can actually destroy them. Because these arms are consumables, there are a multitude of ways for them to break when you use them too. These different ways are being hit during the Devil Breaker action, using break age, or just breaking them with breakaway, which acts as a get off me move while simultaneously switching to the next Devil Breaker. As for this system as a whole, I do love the addition of these arms because they add a new level of depth to this character. Each arm can definitely mix up Nero's option depending on the situation. And while I do like the inclusion of them, my biggest concern is not being able to switch between them on the fly. With all of the tools that each character has between Dante, V, and Vergil, only Nero has to rely on resource management that is strictly tied to his equipment. And yes, while there is some planning that has to be done during each mission for Nero, kind of creating strategy for the character, it all narrows down between picking what is optimal and picking what is fun. When you're forced to pick weapons in a specific order, it greatly restricts the interaction between each Devil Breaker. For someone who plays Nero regularly, my personal favorite Devil Breakers is between GP01 and Punchline, which both of them give a lot of mobility option for this character, especially when you combine it with other abilities. However, there are Devil Breakers that are very useful for very specific situations, such as using Rawhide to stun enemies around you, or using Helter Skelter that allows you to pierce different types of shields. At least with Rawhide, it has other properties to make it useful, but with Helter Skelter, it's almost a one-trick pony outside of its break age, which destroys the Devil Breaker in the process. Even with this idea of strategy in mind, it also means nothing in regular fights once you get to a certain skill level by practicing. The only way you would need to strategize on what arm is right for you if you want to go for a very optimal run. This lack of freedom to be able to use whatever you want at your disposal limits Nero's creative output. Despite the developers clearly stating that they want Nero to not feel like Dante by letting him switch through his Devil Breakers, there have been many people who wanted the inclusion of on-the-fly Devil Breaker switching. Well, with mods on the PC version, this is entirely possible, and oh boy does it really open up Nero as a character. Cyan's collaborative training mod has the ability for Nero to use 8 Devil Breakers all at once while using the D-pad. That means up, down, left, right, and each of the diagonal directions too. This allows Nero to combine different aspects of his breakers using the strength of all of them in harmony. With the design philosophy each arm has, I can honestly say that this does not make Nero feel like Dante in any capacity. With Nero, each Devil Breaker is just a tool rather than a style. They add functions, but each arm has varying degrees of utility that is useful in certain points of a fight. Dante's styles have different types of utility regardless of what situation he's in, and they can augment his weapons and guns if he uses Swordmaster or Gunslinger. Nero also keeps the majority of his moveset if he doesn't have a Devil Breaker, while Dante, if he doesn't have any styles that are usable, he would feel extremely limited because they're an integral part of his gameplay. Itsuno has stated that he did not want Nero to be like Dante, and that is 100% okay. Plus, having all of your Devil Breakers all at once during the campaign would feel a little broken. I do feel that this could have been an in-game sort of thing, like after you beat the game, you unlock this feature. but I perfectly understand why they didn't implement this to begin with. I just wish that it was in. And now since modders have created this mod, I honestly can't go back to vanilla DMC5. One final topic that I would like to talk about is the biggest problem that I truly have with the Devil Breakers, and that is the fact that you cannot use them while you are locked onto a target. This creates problems with the lock-on system because you will find yourself locking onto the wrong enemy while you're using them. This reason is due to wire snatch. While you're locked on, you're only able to use wire snatch. Now, when I first encountered this problem, I was wondering why in the world would they do this? Why would you have two different snatch moves for Nero? And then I realized, oh, they want you to be able to hold an enemy while still being able to use snatch. Huh. Like, I understand the concept, but that really makes a very cumbersome control scheme. At first, this may not seem like a very big problem on the surface level, but when you start to factor in that Nero has two different buttons that you have to hold down that are on the face buttons, you can realize why it's a little cumbersome. So you have to change your controls to something that suits you even better. Now, what I have is okay. I switched out my gun button to something else, but it's still a little clunky. I'll get used to it in due time, but I'm just... While I was a little disappointed with how Devil Breakers was implemented, I will say that I thoroughly love how Devilbringer and Devil Trigger perform with Nero. After Nero unlocks his DT form at the end of the game, he ends up bringing back all of his moves associated with it previously. That includes Snatch and Buster, along with Summon Swords, and even his special moves, Showdown and Maximum Bet. There are also new additions that Nero has received when he regained his demonic powers too. He has gained a third jump, an additional grab pull with Snatch and DT mode, and a new mechanic called Bringer Knuckle, and my goodness, Nero mains, we are eating good because this little punch right here completely elevates Nero's gameplay. While attacking, you can press the Devilbringer button and Nero will attack with a phantom limb in the middle of this attack animation. At first, you think that it will just be extra damage and that's it, but when you use a move that has knockback properties, you can cancel the effect of that knockback in any attack that you do. That includes Shuffle, that includes Streak, that includes your regular combo strings, that includes a grab that you have, that includes all the things that you can think of, and it just completely changes how Nero plays on an advanced level, and it makes him very satisfying to play. The only real downside I can think for Nero's Devil Trigger is that you cannot instantly cancel the activation with an air hike anymore. Devil Trigger for Nero is a very defensive option that he has in DMC4, and DT canceling was a way to cancel many of his attacks. Double jumping right after this activation allows you to act immediately without any pause. You can still do it in DMC5, but it's not as good because there's a pause. Overall, I'm extremely glad that we have a character that was further expanded upon, because he's amazing in this game. The core gameplay that was there in DMC4 is still present in DMC5, but I still wish we could use his Devil Breakers without resorting to mods. As an entire character, Nero is a shining example of easy to pick up but hard to master. The kit he has is very easy to use, but his Exceed and Bringer Knuckle mechanics require precise timing to master on the fly, especially if you want to nail max axe moves on command. With the expansion of his tools with Devil Breakers, I believe Devil May Cry 5 handled Nero fairly well, outside a few personal gripes. Oh boy, are we really at this part already? But, alright, here it goes. Alright, so next up, we have V. And V is a character that had a very divisive reception within the player base. There are those who enjoyed his gameplay to the fullest, and they loved him. And then there's others that, well, let's just say that they would not touch him with a 10-foot pole. My experience with V in my first playthrough and my recent playthrough was serviceable, but I never really liked playing this character all that much. And before I get into that, I want to go over the functions that he has. V behaves much differently when you compare him to the rest of the characters. Instead of weapons, V has the ability to summon creatures to fight for him. There's Griffin, Shadow, and Nightmare. Griffin can shoot projectiles that focus on a single target, or he can charge up an attack to unleash it on a wide area. all of his projectile attacks can also juggle enemies in the air too. Shadow dishes out melee attacks that primarily focuses on a single enemy, although he does have access to AoE moves. Both Griffin and Shadow cannot kill enemies on their own. It is up to V to finish them off with his cane. While V cannot do damage to enemies normally, he can teleport between demons and finish them off with Gambit. He also has the option to use Royal Fork, a projectile-based move that costs 1 bar of DT and covers a decent area. This move inflicts some damage, but it's best to rely on your summons to attack so you're not constantly wasting your DT. You can also power up your summons while spending DT. Speaking of DT, this summon plays a very important role to V's gameplay. Both Griffin and Shadow have health that you need to pay attention to while you're fighting a group of demons. If both of their health bars are depleted, then you lose the ability to attack. Even the mobility that is tied to your summons are no longer usable. This is where Nightmare comes into action. Summoning him will bring back V's minions at full health, allowing him to use them once more. Nightmare spawning can depend on the environment around him. Most of the time, he will appear in the sky and simply fall down. But there are specific areas where Nightmare will bust through a wall or appear as a comet and slam down to the earth. V even has a hitbox that appears when he's summoning Nightmare too. When Nightmare is on the field, he will attack on his own. However, V can ride Nightmare and take direct control over him. He's a little slow, but he packs a powerful punch compared to Shadow and Griffin with his melee attacks. He can also jump, which is interesting. But his best attack is his giant laser called Domination. Once activated, you can dismiss him while he's still using the attack. If you find yourself having a hard time gaining DT, you can actually start reading a book to gain DT in the middle of a fight while attacking with Shadow and Griffin. Someone once told me that in order to play with V, you have to imagine the battlefield like it is a chessboard. His summons are his chess pieces, and you have to move strategically across an area in order to take down foes one by one. Well, I'm sorry to say this, but that is a load of bullcrap, because V is none of that. To me, he feels like a wet noodle caked in cement with the depth of a shallow kiddie pool. Regardless of V having 3 summons to take advantage of, he feels really underwhelming to play, at least for me. When you take a step back and when you look and observe how many moves V has, you think that's a respectable amount, but it's not. When you take a closer look at his tool set, you'll see that the majority of your summon moves are either passive abilities or different levels of the same ability that only do extra damage. When you factor all of these out, he has even less moves than Nero has without any double breakers. And while you're holding down your attack inputs for various attacks, you don't have the ability to reposition V outside of using your sidestep or double jump. When you use those 2 moves, you might as well just kiss your charge goodbye, because doing these actions immediately cancel them. It's even worse if you want to charge attacks for both minions, and trust me, you're going to be doing this very often against large crowds. With Dante, Nero, or Vergil, you have attacks that require you to hold down a button, but most of the time, it's only for a brief moment. When you do encounter a move that forces you to hold down a button longer than usual, it's a move that does a lot of damage. While V nearly gives up a third of his move set for you to hold down a button for almost 4 seconds, forcing you to just jump awkwardly away from oncoming attacks until you gain enough DT. He lacks the same feedback that you get from a regular character. Too often I find myself distant from V while I'm playing him. My button presses don't feel immediate when I'm trying to attack, especially for Shadow. You have to wait until he appears near the target to use melee attacks instead of being able to attack immediately. And when he's not within range of any enemy, he just returns back to you. You spend a lot of time just waiting for your moves to charge, and if you aren't careful enough, they will go down quickly. He has no fun movement options outside of using Gambit, and you don't want to use this unless you're trying to finish an enemy off. Huh? What's that? Both of your summons are gone and you have no DT? Well, buddy, you better be prepared to emulate the cutscenes, because now you have to hobble around like a big baby bitch until you have enough DT back. Like, what is this? What even is this? I want to play as a demon hunter who's a badass motherfucker, not a physically disabled person that looks like he can start his own boy band. And that's not to say that V can't be played in a masterful way. He can, but the problem is that he's just not very fun for me. Every time that I see a triple S rank pop up on my screen, I don't feel like I've earned it. Granted, triple S ranks are hard to get, I know, but like, he's the easiest character that can generate so much damage with very minimal effort. And the straw that breaks the camel's back is that you cannot reposition your summons at all outside of using a sidestep or a double jump. You don't have direct control over any of them except for Nightmare, who's the slowest one. You know, I played Astral Chain ages ago, and honestly, I love how they handle the combat for your summons. They act as an extension of your character, giving you absolute control of how you want to position them and how you want to attack with them. When I played this game, this is how I wanted V to feel, but instead we got this. From the beginning, I've tried to give V a chance, and I was very hopeful with the previews of the character, but the more I played, the more dissatisfied I became. So much so, I proceeded to use a mod that allowed me to play any character on any stage without even touching V at all. While I did love the idea of V, I fully believe that he was not executed in a perfect way at all.
Wow, thy branches mix with mine, and our roots together join.
While I wasn't happy what we got with V, I will say that I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Vergil when the Special Edition was released. Well, in my case, just the character, because Special Edition doesn't exist on PC for some ungodly reason. But I digress. With his return in Devil May Cry 5, he went through a few changes when you compare it to his previous iteration. Yamato, Beowulf, and now Force Edge's replacement, Mirage Edge, are all available to use just like how they were in their previous games. Each weapon retains all the moves that they had in DMC3 and 4. Yamato gains new moves like Aerial Cleave and Void Slash. Both have their use in combat in a very stylish manner, and honestly, I just really love how Void Slash looks. Like, this move is fucking cool. One thing I really like about Yamato now is that you can link Judgment Cuts multiple times without having to exploit a certain mechanic just to pull it off. With Beowulf, it acts almost identical to how it was in Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition, even having just charge frames where you release your attacks just as it finishes charging. I say almost because the biggest change is Beowulf's Starfall move. In Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition, this move used to knock demons down at a downward angle. This made it very hard to jump cancel the move and catch enemies without resorting to using a summon sword so the enemy doesn't fly away from you. But now, this move performs how it did in DMC3, but with even better tracking. There's also the feature of extending kick 13 now by holding down the attack button. Before, you had to use DT in order to extend this move, but now you don't have to be in DT at all. As for Mirage Edge, while being a different sword altogether, it works just like Force Edge with a few differences. Aerial Stinger now covers more distance than it did before, and Overdrive has a longer lasting wave. Although I do believe that Aerial Stinger's hitbox is far too big. For some reason, it completely halts Vergil's movement even when you're high above the enemy. Concentration also makes its return, which buffs each weapon with increased range for Yamato, an additional level charge for Beowulf, and Mirage Edge, which got a little bit of a change. Now it deals stun damage rather than having multiple hits. While I'm not too fond of it, it does serve a way to absolutely decimate demons depending on how well you do. It even brings back Yamato's Judgment Cut in, while also giving super moves to both Beowulf and Mirage Edge. All three moves also require concentration to perform it. Finally, Vergil has his summoned swords, which not really much has changed in their practicality. Everything works more or less the same way how they did in Devil May Cry 4 SE. My only complaint is that they look fairly tiny. The impact of these swords in 4 and 3 felt more satisfying compared to the swords resembling tiny toothpicks, but as long as they work well, I guess I don't have too much to be upset about, but that bugs me so much. Of course, Vergil would not be Vergil without his air trick. And thank you, Jesus, because it works better than it did in DMC4. You cannot use air trick up unless there's no embedded sword on the enemy, or if you exploited a glitch with judgment cut in. Nor could you use back trick unless you were in DT. This made air trick in DMC4 SC very frustrating to use in my personal opinion. But now, since these restrictions are gone, air trick feels much better in DMC5 compared to DMC4, but not without a few issues, of course. In order to trick up, you need to let go of the lock-on button. To do a trick down, you need to press the analog stick back and forward. Why couldn't this work like DMC3? What was this decision? For those who don't remember how it used to work in DMC3, let me give you a small rundown. When you're locked on a target, pressing circle will teleport Vergil to the enemy. Pressing towards the enemy and pressing circle at the same time will cause Vergil to go up with trick up. Pressing back from the enemy and circle will cause Vergil to go back. This is much better to use in quick succession because you don't have to waggle your control stick and will constantly let go of the lock-on button with juggling the enemy, which is already annoying enough to deal with the lock-on system, which I will get into in another part. I know I keep saying it, but I'm going to get to it. Luckily, Cyan's collab trainer restores DMC3 air trick inputs for Vergil, making him less cumbersome to play. Regardless of this issue, the return of both trick up and trick back is a welcome change, and combining it with judgment cuts is really sick too. In place of Devil Trigger, we now have Doppelganger and Sin Devil Trigger. Doppelganger makes its return based off of the reboot version of this ability. With the D-pad, you can dictate how fast or how slow the clone copies Vergil. While you are free to use any weapon while having this activated, Vergil's clone will always use Yamato. He will copy the inputs you do rather than what Vergil does himself. So with some shenanigans, you can actually desync the clone from Vergil to perform some pretty interesting stuff. And that doesn't stop there. You can actually control the clone by yourself if Vergil uses his samurai time. Paired to his doppelganger activation input, there is also his Sin Double Trigger. This functions like Double Trigger, but without the health regen. He even has combos and moves with different properties too. Like DMC4 in DT mode, Vergil will perform an additional attack along with the combo itself. With all that said about this character and the few problems that I discussed, I personally believe that this Vergil is the best iteration of Vergil that we have ever had. There's no shortage of complex combos that you can pull off either. Nearly each attack that he does comes with a purpose and you can use them in a stylish way. And while I may have some grievances with a few of his tools, it's not nearly enough to consider him lackluster in any way. I want to point out somehow that with every iteration of Vergil, he's kind of, well, broken. Like, too good broken. Like, he is so good that he not only gives V the ability to levitate, something that he never had, but he also makes his familiars better. Griffin out here shooting out level 3 blockades in less than 3 seconds, mind you. Huh? Where is this at, Griffin? Why couldn't you do this when I played V? Overall, there's not much I can list that's negative about Vergil. He is an extraordinary character from what I've experienced, and I'm quite happy with his appearance in Devil May Cry 5. But now, it's time to move on to the main event. It is finally time to talk about Dante. I saved him for last because, well, Dante is the deepest action game character from any game that I've ever played. No game that I can think of comes close to how many different attacks with different properties that Dante has. Even in the earlier series, he has always had a high number of moves associated with him. Before DMC5 was released, DMC3 Dante had the most moves in the entire franchise. Well, now DMC5 has taken that throne because he has an abundance of moves in this game. With this last character section, I want to go over as much as I can, so please bear with me here. Okay, starting up. Let's talk about Dante's styles. In this game, he has 4 different styles as opposed to DMC4 where he had 5 of them. You may think that this is a downgrade, but I assure you it is not. One reason being is because the styles in 5 are more fleshed out than how they were in the previous game. For example, Warrior Guard in DMC4 was really bad. The risk reward is so awful since it takes so much to fill up your gauge to reap the rewards of consistent royal blocks. And don't get me started on Dreadnought. It takes ages to charge up, burns all your meter, and forces you to walk slowly, and you can't revert back until your meter is depleted. But hey, I guess it makes you invisible, so that's fair. I guess. Meanwhile, for DMC5, perfect blocks give you more meter, you can walk while you're guarding, and regular blocks do not deplete your health if you have Devil Trigger. The biggest change is that Dreadnought is now replaced by Royal Revenge, arguably the best move for his back plus lock-on input. You can use this to spend only 1 bar of your meter to reflect back at the demons, even from a distance. This ability comes out instantly and he can hold it forever. This is the type of change that I'm talking about. Now picture this with all of the styles that Dante has. Gunslinger now gives Coyote A movement options to set itself apart from a regular Stinger. Trickster now gives you Trick Down, and Swordmaster? Yeah, I'm gonna get into Swordmaster later. Like you will see. For now, I'm just gonna talk about Dante's guns and just go over it. Dante's guns serve as his long-range options in case you don't wish to get close. He has 4 of them, all of which are varied in their own way. Ebony and Ivory and Coyote A are his standard guns that have been present since DMC1. However, in this game, you can shoot Ebony and Ivory independently in Gunslinger mode, with Ivory having a burst shot and Ebony having a powered shot that can stagger demons with the style button. With this in place, twosome time is now done by pressing the style button, while in Gunslinger after the gun button, and vice versa. Rainstorm can now juggle enemies that are next to Dante, which is alright. I still prefer the Rainstorm in DMC4 because of how quick it was. Coyote A, on the other hand, has experienced nothing but positive changes left and right for its gunslinger moves. Backslide no longer is locked in one direction anymore. Now you can input the move no matter where Dante is facing, and it actually lets him aim in that direction. Gunstinger now has cut-in, which includes variations that allow for different types of mobility options. You even have enough time to charge in between shots. I can't stress how much I love how this shotgun works in this game. It is fantastical. Moving on though, Kalina Ann also makes its return in DMC5, but this time there's 2 of them? Well, anyway, all of Kalina Ann's old moves come back from DMC3 and 4, with the exception of Grapple. With double Kalina Ann, there are new moves set in place too, like Cascade, Blaster Twins, and Mega Cascade. As cool as these moves are, I don't know if I particularly like this gun. I say this because due to my playstyle, I only ever use Blaster Twins and occasionally Cascade. I won't deny that it can be useful though, since it does quite a lot of damage to a large crowd. Now it's time to talk about a new gun, or hat? Should I say hat? Anyway, we're talking about Faust Hat. Unlike Dante's traditional guns, this new piece of equipment allows you to dispense orbs that you've collected as an actual attack. You can earn tons of orbs with this gun too. Although, this gun has a few risks to consider. When you toss out Faust with set hat or man in red, a little hat appears on a demon's head when they're hit by either move. Once marked by either move, demons will start to drop a ton of orbs for you to collect when you hit them. However, if they hit you, you proceed to lose a ton of red orbs based on the damage that you're being dealt. With all that being said, this thing is an orb farming machine. In fact, I actually managed to farm every move in this game for all characters within 20 minutes of farming. Outside of this orb gimmick, Faust Hat on its own is sort of a wild card. It's capable of doing a lot of things. You can pull enemies towards you, coat yourself with an armor of projectiles, set out a mini hat that allows you to attack and shoot at the same time, and you do insane damage with it. Easily enough to melt down boss health. It's such a wacky weapon and it utterly fits Dante perfectly. Red Shot is the only move that I can think of that I have problems with, but outside of all the moves that Faust Hat has, I think I'm really content on what Faust Hat brings to the table. Speaking of wacky weapons, let's get into Dante's Devil Arms. Dante altogether has 7 different weapons, but 3 of them are duplicates of another weapon. He has Rebellion to start off with, but then he unlocks Sparta and eventually Devil's Sword Dante at the end. Rebellion and Sparta functions pretty much the same as usual, with Sparta dealing more damage during certain attacks. I really did wish that Sparta had unique moves that made this weapon more worthwhile, but I assumed that Sparta was only in the game due to story purposes, which I guess that's fine. Paired with Rebellion, you also start off with Balrog in the beginning of the game, which is vastly different compared to all the gauntlet weapons that Dante has used so far. For example, instead of using kicks and punches within his combos, they are now separated into different modes called kick mode and blow mode. Kick mode focuses on kicks, and blow mode focuses on punches. You can swap between the two modes at any time you have this weapon equipped. Balrog also has another mechanic that powers up this weapon, called Ignition. If you land enough successful hits with blow mode, or if you activate a stance in kick mode, it changes Balrog's properties so that you dish out more damage, change the knockback for certain moves, and even lets you have access to new moves too. I can see the amount of work that Capcom put into this weapon, it definitely shows, but I don't like having to switch between different modes, and I also don't like the fact that I have to use Ignition to have access to real impact. It's kind of inconvenient and a little excessive, but maybe it was the only way that they can fit so much into one weapon. It's a solid devil arm, but it has a few hiccups in my opinion. The third weapon I would like to talk about is the motorcycle chainsaw hybrid Cavalier. This weapon is something, I can tell you that much. You can switch between two different forms, alternating between regular melee attacks and swordmaster attacks. It has super armor, and there's this gear wheel mode that increases the speed and amount of damage that you do. When you hold down the button that you're attacking with, the next attack will be stronger and faster. If you release the button and attack again at the right time, you will get the maximum benefit. The DLC version of this weapon allows you to use Redline, a forward launching move that catapults Dante. It's fast and you can jump cancel it once it hits the enemy. This move is the fastest attack that Dante has for this weapon. Meanwhile, the rest of his attacks for Cavalier feel a little snail-like and heavy. I'll be upfront and say that I honestly believe that this weapon is my least favorite out of all of them because of how slow it is. I perfectly understand the point of this weapon since it deals a lot of damage when you take advantage of the gear wheel system, and there are some attacks that are extremely useful to use, like wheelie jump and high side. However, I just don't like using Cavalier, at least by itself. It's like pulling out the wrong move in DMC4 with Pandora and then you looking silly every time that you use it. What I do like though is the feel of King Cerberus, which is Dante's replacement of Cerberus from DMC3. Each attack feels snappy and has a good feel to it, except for swing, but I want to say it's to keep the player in the air much longer. The main gimmick of this weapon is that you can shift between three distinct forms: ice nunchucks, a tri-segment lightning staff, and a fire pole staff. Ice is the weapon's main form, having all normal melee attacks to perform similarly how they did in DMC3. Lightning can be accessed by holding down a melee button or the Swordmaster button for a quick moment and then releasing the button to execute an attack. As for fire, this form is only used in Swordmaster. Analyzing all of King Cerberus' moves made me realize just how versatile this weapon can really be. Revolver in the air makes a great tool to juggle enemies, giving yourself a breather to swap between your weapons. Long barrel can launch enemies away and hit multiple targets by switching between them. And there's pole play that can be really useful for dealing with enemies that are directly below you. King Cerberus is definitely a well-rounded weapon, and I can't really pinpoint many negatives to it. Maybe the bow staff form can have more useful moves, but what we have as a full package works really well for this double arm. Alright, so finally, the moment we've all been waiting for Dante. I finally get to talk about his main weapon, which is Devil Sword Dante. Devil Sword Dante, or DSD for short, appears once Dante merges Rebellion and Sparta to create this weapon, which changes around a few moves. It placed some Swordmaster moves onto its regular weapon skill list, so now you can use Aerial Rave and Prop without the use of Swordmaster. Although with Prop, you have to use it within a combo, which gets rid of its immediate availability. Helmbreaker can be used in conjunction with Aerial Rave too, but the input is now back in melee, so you no longer are able to direct this move anywhere else other than towards the enemy that you are locked onto. Kind of a bummer, but only a small issue in the grand scheme of things. Because the trade-off for all of this is that Dante has his own version of Vergil's summon swords, which it is absolutely bonkers. Now, Do you remember when I talked about Bringer Knuckle for Nero and how you can intercept moves that push enemies away? Dante now has that similar ability with his sword equipped. And that's not all either. He can launch demons upwards and even use a projectile that acts just like a stinger and carries enemies with the sword. He can even do this without attacking. Even if you're using a different weapon, if you're fast enough, you can switch back to DSD and use sword formations. He even has a round trip that you can hold down using the style button. Like, it's as if Dante really looked at Vergil, saw his area round trip and said, "Alright bro, I'll do you one better." Because the sword flies on their own without even pausing Dante. There's so much potential for DSD, it's insane to think about what's possible. You thought I was done? Nah, son. This sword is Dante's utility belt, so sit back so I can educate you further. If you hold down the melee button for a brief moment, you will begin to charge DSD. When it's fully charged, or if you're just in DT, DSD now augments all of your styles. Trickster gives you an extra Sky Star, Air Trick, and a jump in the air. Royal Guard increases the meter that you gain while blocking. Gunslinger will automatically shoot enemies that you're not locked onto, knocking them away. And Swordmaster, dear lord, Swordmaster. DSD treats this style like it's its baby, because every attack that Dante does is now enhanced with more damage, some gaining new attributes, and some moves that had weaknesses are now covered with DSD. Like using Real Impact now spawns this giant whirling fan of blades that draws in enemies. Or activating Ignition in kick mode has spiral swords that rotate around Dante that gives him a hitbox around him. This weapon is utterly insane. But this is the weapon that keeps on giving. Paired with this weapon is Sin Double Trigger. To use this form, you must sacrifice your regular Double Trigger gauge into your Sin Double Trigger gauge by holding down the DT button. After you activate this state, an animation plays out before Dante transforms into Sin Double Trigger. In this new demonic form that Dante sports, he has access to another set of abilities that are completely different from his original moveset. He can jump high, fly, teleport, turn himself into a spinning drill, shoot giant energy balls and missiles, can summon a black hole, and he can obliterate everything around him with a move called Judgment. At first glance, this form may seem like a whole DT the win solution, however it's not just that. If you manage to get a triple S style rank while fighting demons, the transforming animation is completely skipped. Now you have the option to cancel any move that Dante has to shift in and out of the Sin Double Trigger. This is all thanks to quadruple S rank, a new skill that actually rewards the player for getting triple S rank. This is the only time where style ranking matters to access other moves. This character is nuts. I cannot believe the developers managed to fit so much onto this character. The wildest thing is that you can choose to have every weapon equipped on you, or just say, you know what, I'm too good for a weapon, and just fight with only Royal Guard. Despite Dante having all these moves, some of you may wonder why anyone would ever return back to the previous games to play them. Dante, along with other characters, have more options in contrast to how they used to be. So you would think that DMC5 would be the definitive experience for these games. Well, let me try to explain. Devil May Cry 5 may be a tightly packed action game filled to the brim with a colossal amount of system mechanics for a player to experiment with, but it's not without its problems on the more technical side of things. Since Devil May Cry 5 was an action game that had newcomers in mind, there were changes that were definitely made to reflect upon that. This isn't to say that catering towards newcomers is bad. In fact, I would love for more people to dabble around in DMC's gameplay more, but when it comes at the cost of decreasing the gravity or making certain attack animations slower for the sake of realism, then I'm not so sure how I feel about that. One of the reasons why I love the series so much is that most of the attack animations felt snappy and fast, especially in DMC3 and 4. Even with the fast attack speed, each move had a nice, weighty feel to them. Taking all of this into consideration, this made DMC3 and 4 feel very responsive to play. DMC5 not only slowed down some of these animations by adding extra frames or changing attack timings, but it also increased the gravity and made hitboxes big. Like, really big. I've already showed you with Vergil on how absurd his hitbox is for his aerial stinger, but there are other moves with other characters that have big hitboxes. Even the hitbox for you to enemy step is kind of huge. As for the gravity, it's pretty self-explanatory. DMC5 has lowered the gravity even with turbo mode accounted for. All of these issues are most likely tied to making the game feel easier to perform aerial stunts with the characters. But all of this amounts to making the game feel very clunky, and you can feel it when you start testing how fast you can cancel attacks. There's also the removal of certain mechanics like inertia and reversals. Inertia is a mechanic in DMC4 that allows you to redirect your movement in the air. First, you need to build up momentum with a specific move. Then you can use that momentum to carry yourself in a direction. You can also preserve your momentum and use it with different attacks. And the biggest application for this mechanic was utilizing guard flying, a technique that transfers your momentum into a guard that sends you flying. You simply generate momentum, and after jump canceling, you then guard. Now, I can understand why this would be taken out. It's one of those mechanics where the devs would think that it will be frustrating for a player to just drift away from enemies in the middle of an attack string, but when I first learned how to play DMC4, I'd never dealt with this issue at all. Once when I got better at the game, I could actually use this mechanic effectively, and I ended up having more fun with the combat system than I did previously. Reversals are sort of a different story though. For those who don't know what a reversal is using a lock-on move and redirecting it in a different direction. To do this, input the move that you wish to do, let go of the lock-on button, and then point the direction that you wish to go. You have to do this during a move such as a roll or an attack. That way you can buffer the input during that action. This opened up a lot of opportunities for a player to maneuver around the battlefield however you wanted to, with complete and total freedom. This technique was in the demo of DMC5 and is actually in the base game, if there's no enemy present, that is. You can do this like you could in DMC3 and 4 when there's no enemy spawned around you, but the moment one shows up, you cannot redirect your locked on moves. And I think the worst part about all of this is that the developers has stated that the reason why it was taken out was because players were doing it accidentally.
We found a lot of people that when testing the game, they would accidentally do that. They would accidentally go in the opposite direction. They would actually go in the direction they want.
Now, I can deal with not having inertia, but reversals is such a useful mechanic because you can do this with any move at any given time. Having that gone really destroys a lot of combat potential and mobility. But that's still not the end of it. There's DLC weapons that you can't use in Bloody Palace. I shouldn't have to explain why this is bad. It's a terrible decision, arcade points or not. Specifically talking about GP01 and Cavalier R. Both weapons have one really good move that's useful. There's also the lack of Special Edition, which I've complained about earlier, that's been absent from Steam. Special Edition usually have Turbo Mode along with it, which is present on PS5 and Xbox Series X versions of DMC5 along with other features, but not the PC version. At this point, I really shouldn't complain about it since mods have brought these features onto the PC version, but I'm still kind of pissed about it. With all of what I listed so far, you may feel like these objections are very unreasonable. Although if you take into consideration that a lot of people, myself included, have spent years playing DMC4 and DMC3, playing DMC5 is a widely different experience that some may or may not enjoy. I'll admit, even I was pretty bothered about the issues that I've talked about. I even compared my experience with Melee and Brawl many different times. Melee having faster, tighter controls compared to Brawl that had a multitude of issues that I did not enjoy at all. But let me tell you, the biggest problem that has been very, very consistent with me every time that I booted up DMC5, and that is the camera constantly freaking the hell out of me every time I get into a small room. Or hell, not even just a small room, but an open ass field where there's nothing, just absolutely nothing obscuring the camera. And it just spins, just fucking spins for no reason. Absolutely no reason. It's like the person behind the camera is getting so hyped at my combos that they want to try out their own tricks too while annoying the hell out of me. Hello? Hello? I'm right here, you dumbass! I think my game is cursed. You know, I think it is really cursed because this happens to me more than anyone else. And yes, there has been other people who experienced the same thing, the absolutely same insane, moronic shit that's been happening to me. And I feel like I'm an anomaly. Like I don't know, man. Like my game does this more than anyone else. Like it happens every time I stream, every time I pick up this game and play it. Almost every game session that I do in a mission, this happens in. So, in conclusion, after painstakingly listing my negatives about DMC5 just now, where do I stand with it? Regardless of my personal nitpicks on the game or distinct mechanics not present in DMC5, I actually really like this game. It offers an experience that I cannot get from any other game, period. Even with how much I love playing DMC4, I can't help but to feel restricted every time I glance at the large kit that each character has in DMC5. The endless possibilities of all sorts of combos feels much elevated here. There are so many different combinations that you can pull off. The sky is the limit here, and all that is required is your imagination to pull it off. Thank you for watching, everyone. This took up a lot of my time to compile together into one singular video. I've been playing Devil May Cry for more than 10 years now, so I feel like it was necessary to weigh in my personal experience with DMC5, and I hope you guys understand the angle that I'm coming from. If not, then I guess I understand. So, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, provide any feedback in the comments below, and I will see you all next time.